Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video. You know, there's been a lot of uh, 10 things that have influenced you going around on Facebook, maybe on YouTube, and so forth. 10 movies that have influenced you, 10 comic books that have influenced you. I thought I would do a video on the 10 games that have influenced my gaming tastes, that have influenced my gaming collection, all that. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about this rather than just posting some of these on Facebook, which I still may do, but I thought that the video would give a better look into why these things are so important to me and why they influenced me into still being a gamer some 30 years later. I became a gamer in 1988. I was familiar with video games such as the Atari. Excuse the people outside working on the house across the street, their lawn. But I was a game. I knew of video games like the Atari a few years before I became a gamer, but I never was really interested in those games as much until 1988, 30 years later. So, what better top 10 list, top 10 things that have influenced you to come up with other than games for me? Now, this video might be a little long, so it may not be everyone's cup of tea, especially if you're not into video games. So, but if you want to stick around, please bear with me. Okay. At number 10 for me, Street Fighter II. Now, this is the Turbo Edition. In truth, the original release of this, just Street Fighter II, would be more influential to me. So why is this game number 10 on my list? Why is this game influential to me? Well, before Street Fighter, I played Street Fighter for the first time in 1992. I got it in 1992. Before that, I had never played a fighting game. This was the very first fighting game I ever played. Now, it was made by Capcom. I liked Capcom. I saw the advertisements for this in the Nintendo Power and in GamePro. I thought the graphics looked great. To me, it looked like Final Fight, which I had gotten the fall beforehand in 1991, October 1991. So I figured, well, Street Fighter, this looks like a Final Fight type game. But before the release of it, I found out that no, this is not a Final Fight type game, which is a brawler. It's an actual you versus the computer in a match. That's all it is. And I was like, why would they make a game like that? Because I was thinking, well, what's the point of doing that? I mean, how's that really attract people to the game? But I still got the game. And that question was answered very quickly. I remember I got this at the end of June of 1992, and I was playing it over and over again. I wanted to play it as all the characters and see all their different endings. I remember playing this through the 4th of July that year. I remember my favorite movie, favorite Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, Commando, was coming on. And, every now and then that movie would pop up and I didn't want to miss it. But I missed large portions of that movie because I just could not keep away from this game. The graphics, everything. This was a new type of game for me to play. And this is obviously the second incarnation of it, the Turbo Edition, where you could be the bosses and it moves faster. But there were so many incarnations of Street Fighter II. If it not had been for the first version of it, the one that I played back in June 1992, I would not have been in the fighting genre as I was for many years. I would not have given other fighting games a chance if not for Street Fighter II. And I think Street Fighter II, stepping aside away from me, influenced many developers, many people, and made a lot of people gamers. Number 9, Assassin's Creed 2. This is what we would call a more modern game. Came out about what? 2009? Almost 10 years ago? So, I had played the first Assassin's Creed. I had it. And the thing about the Assassin's Creed games is that, you're an assassin, and you go through all these historical time periods and you interact with historical characters. So that being said, I played the first one and it wasn't that bad. Doing the acrobatics, assassinating certain people, all that stuff. Pretty intriguing game, pretty intriguing storyline, but it took place during the Crusades. And for me, I was never a real big fan of the Crusades or anything like that. So I wasn't really interested in meeting Saladin or interested in running into King Richard the Lionheart or anything like that. So it didn't really connect with me, but I acknowledged that it was a pretty decent game. So when they announced this one was coming out, I was like, well, it's probably going to be more like the first one. But I took a chance with it anyway because I heard rave reviews, okay? And my God, when I first played this, it was mind-blowing. This one takes place several hundred years after the first one. Now they trade Jerusalem for Venice, for Florence during the Renaissance. And you take on the new character, Ezio, who's supposed to be a long down the line descendant of the character in the first game, Altair. Man, going through the Renaissance in Italy was amazing. It was amazing. It was brought to life like no other game. There was no other game like it. There was no other game that had such rich detail to such historical things, and your character would interact with historical figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Machiavelli, and many others. And it was just such an intriguing thing, and the storyline just grabbed you. And I felt with this one, the character Ezio, I think he's one of the most popular, if not the popular assassin introduced in the series. He had a bunch of other games came out, and his story concluded a couple years later in Assassin's Creed Revelations, where he's a much older Ezio. You really became invested in this character. For me, I wasn't really invested in Altair. He had a story, but he wasn't as interesting as Ezio. You didn't feel for him as much. And this was the first game that introduced such historical fiction to me that just grabbed me. And it was amazing. It's amazing to this very day. Coming in at number 8, Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Like I said earlier, Street Fighter introduced me to the fighting genre, and if not for Street Fighter, I would never have gotten into Mortal Kombat. Now, this release came out for the PlayStation in September of 1996. So there were a couple Mortal Kombats. Mortal Kombat 1 came out in 93 for the home consoles. 2, which I thought was the best at that point, well, up until this point, came out in 1994. Number 5 came out in 95, and Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 came out in 1995. So when they released, Midway said that there was going to be a Mortal Kombat trilogy with every character that was in every single Mortal Kombat, and you'd be able to go to all different stages throughout the Mortal Kombat universe. I was pumped. I was really pumped. Because Mortal Kombat at that time became my favorite fighting game. It surpassed Street Fighter for me. So I had the N64, and I waited for the N64 version to come out. Like I said, this came out in September. The N64 version didn't come out till November. I found out that it was purposely delayed because Nintendo did not want Mortal Kombat to interfere with their sales of Super Mario 64. So they purposely delayed it so that Mario 64 would get a decent amount of sales, which I didn't like. I remember going to Funkoland and playing this game and seeing it, and I'm like, oh my God, this is heaven. Heaven for a Mortal Kombat fan. When I got my N64 version, you couldn't be every character. The sound wasn't as good, and it was an utter disappointment for me. Still a good game, but it didn't, sort of the steam in that just went right out. And as time went on, not too much time, I said, man, I would just love to play Mortal Kombat Trilogy on the PlayStation. And what happened was, I wound up getting a PlayStation because of this game. So this game, which I love, the game is great. But one of the reasons, the main reason why this is on the list, is because this was the game that made me get a PlayStation 1. And PlayStation went on to be my favorite video game system. Because of this, because of a fighting game. Remember I said a few moments ago, a fighting game, how are you going to keep players' attention with that? There's not much story or anything. Well, fighting game was good enough for me to buy a whole new console and turn my back on Nintendo, because that's when I used to be a big Nintendo fan. After that, no more. Alright. Number 7. For the original Xbox, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, the first game. This came out between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. If George Lucas decided to do this series, because there was another sequel to this, instead of those prequels, I think we would all be talking about the prequels in a much different light. And I think that light would be in a positive one. This game was amazing. Absolutely amazing. If you were a Star Wars fan, it was a Star Wars role-playing game where you develop your character and learn Jedi powers, and you could be good or evil, you could construct lightsabers. It was amazing for a Star Wars fan. And I was a Star Wars fan, but this made me want to become even bigger Star Wars fan. And then Revenge of the Sith came out, and you're like, ugh. Absolutely influential, wonderful. And eventually they released a sequel, which was just as good, but not as good. It was just as good, but it needed to be more than just as good. And they never came out with a part 3, unfortunately. But that game also introduced me to BioWare, which would release some of my favorite games like Mass Effect, Dragon Age, and so forth. Coming in at number 6. Resident Evil. Resident Evil started out as a remake for a survival horror game that came out in Japan in 1989 only in Japan, called Sweet Home. Then the game development took a life on its own and became an entirely new IP, and we get Resident Evil. I've talked about the first time I saw this game played. I could recount to you vividly when I first saw this game played. I had never played a game like this, or have seen a game like this before at that time. A survival horror game. Sure, there were horror type games like Splatterhouse and those LJN, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th games based on horror movies. But never an original type game that was just amazing. And Capcom released this, the same people that released Street Fighter, with those big cartoony manga-looking characters. And then they released something that was very realistic, very different than the art style that I was used to from Capcom with Street Fighter, Mega Man, those Disney games like DuckTales and Chip 'n Dales and all that other stuff. Completely different, more adult-orientated. And I had just gotten the PlayStation about a month earlier. And I was saying to myself, a few weeks before I saw this game played, I got the PlayStation. I'm saying, did I do the right thing? Because some of the games that are coming out for the PlayStation, I could easily get for the Sega Saturn. Why did I get the PlayStation? This affirmed that I made the right decision. Unbelievable. Unbelievable game. Gave birth to so many sequels and movies. It must have been more influential to other people than me. Coming in at number 5. Castlevania. During the summer of 1988, shortly after I got the Nintendo, my cousin would come over to my house for a week, and sometimes I'd go over to her house for a week. We're both the same age. and she had Nintendo, and that's where I first saw Nintendo, played at her house. Anyway, she'd called me, and she's coming the next day, and we're talking and all that stuff. She says, "Hey, I got this new game. You like horror and monsters and all that stuff. I got this new game I think you'd like. It's called Castlevania. I'll bring it tomorrow." She brought it. And I'm glad she did, because ever since then, I've been a big Castlevania fan. Even games that weren't as good, like Simon's Quest and so forth, I still enjoyed to some extent. And Castlevania, there's no doubt that it's been a very important title for me. It had a wonderful balance of that classic universal horror monsters theme and difficulty. And I can only hope that they release another great Castlevania game sometime soon. Number 4. Let me take it out of its shell here. Final Fantasy III. This is on this list because this was the very first role-playing game I ever played. When I started hanging out with my friend Chris, and this was back in 1995, I first met him, and when I was first led into his house, to his room, he was playing the Sega CD. He was playing a game called Lunar 2. And I said, "What is this?" And he said, "It's Lunar 2, it's a role-playing game." I was like, "Ugh, one of those?" I was like, I don't like those that much. But he loved them. Shortly after that, he got Final Fantasy III, and I would watch him play this game for hours upon hours. Didn't have much of a choice other than leaving, but I didn't want to go anywhere. I'd watch him play this, and as I watched him play this, I became converted to the RPG genre. I got it at the Funkoland where he got his, and I said, I want to give this game a shot. I want to give these type of games a shot after watching him play, and I did. And I became an RPG fan. A few months later, Final Fantasy VII came out. Now, Final Fantasy VII, I think, is regarded as the Final Fantasy that made the series mainstream, at least throughout the world. I know RPGs, in particular Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior, were very popular in Japan since they came out in the late 80s, early 90s, but they never really caught on, I think, here in the United States, or I dare say, speak for Europe. I don't think it really caught on in Europe as much, but when Final Fantasy VII came out, it became mainstream. Despite the fact that 7 made it mainstream, I think that the best one, especially for fans before 7, before 7 came out, would regard number 3, which is actually number 6 in Japan, as the best one. For its characters, its story, its length, everything. Number 3. The Elder Scrolls Morrowind. Whereas Final Fantasy III introduced me to the RPG genre, this game introduced me to the mutated version of an RPG genre called open world. When I got this, I heard it was an RPG. I was an RPG fan. I was a seasoned RPG fan by the time this thing came out for the console. I got it, looked pretty good, and I was like, what the hell do I do in this? Usually in RPGs, despite the fact that you could explore the world, there's usually a linear path. Well, you got to go to Nibelheim and find Sephiroth. That's where you got to go. You can't go to these other places. You can't go to the City of the Ancients yet. Well, with this game, you could go anywhere you want, provided that you could get there by using one of those stilt striders or walking there. You can get there. You may not survive long, but you can get there. This was unbelievable. I didn't know what the hell this was. And it took me 2 years to really dedicate myself to actually playing a game. But when I did, and when I got the hang of it, I couldn't put this game down. I said, I want more games like this and less games like Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy are like the Japanese role-playing games. I want more of the American ones with this open world stuff. And I did. I did get that. And I just thought it was amazing. Absolutely amazing. When you're playing this game, some of the atmosphere of it, you can't help but feel like the creators of Morrowind took a lot of influence from a lot of different cultures in the world, but also some movies. The movie that stands out the most for me, that I think this game borrowed some pretty significant elements from, was The Dark Crystal, a Jim Henson movie from the early 80s. You don't have characters like the Skeksis running around in it, but the world looked like the Dark Crystal. Very much so. And it was truly a it was a game that definitely immersed you in a completely different world, not your typical medieval setting that we're used to with some role-playing games. Like with Final Fantasy 3 or 6, whatever you want to call it, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion came out and I think made this series mainstream. But to the real fan of this series, I think it was Morrowind that captured everyone's heart. Number 2. Who could deny the nice shiny gold cart of The Legend of Zelda? When I first got the Nintendo in 1988, I remember seeing commercials for games, and I remember one in particular that had John Caesar in it. You know who John Caesar is? He voiced the Crypt Keeper in Tales from the Crypt. So he was in this commercial. It was a Zelda commercial, and I saw the commercial. It's on YouTube and all that stuff. It was kind of a goofy commercial, actually. But it worked. It got my attention. And then I wanted Zelda, and I got it. And the reason why this is so influential to me is because this, like what Final Fantasy III introduced me to the role-playing game, the Elder Scrolls introduced me to the open world role-playing game, this game introduced me to the action-adventure game. Before this, I was playing Super Mario Brothers, which is a platformer. You get to the end of the level, you jump over obstacles, some easy, some difficult. This was the first time where you're thrust into an adventure. You got to go to level 1 and get the bow, an arrow. You got to get the candle to get through this. You got to get the raft to get to level 3 or 4, whatever the hell it was, 5. I don't remember. You got to use the flute to get to level 7. Collecting items and going through a strange world. It's sort of medieval, unlike Morrowind, which was just bizarre. Absolutely excellent game. This is a game, any one of these games that's on this list, actually, I could play today and enjoy it. But this is one of them that I think many people would agree that they could just pick up and play again, despite the fact it's 31 years old. This is my original copy, too. You can see I messed it up a little. And number 1, what was the most influential video game I ever played that made me a gamer, that made me attracted to this hobby, a hobby that I've been in for 30 years this year. Just had my 30th anniversary. What is it? Without a doubt, Super Mario Brothers. Everyone could debate what was the best Super Mario Brothers, just as everyone could debate what the best Elder Scrolls or Zelda or Final Fantasy is or was. To me, this game introduced me to Nintendo. Let me rephrase that a bit. It was Excitebike that introduced me to Nintendo, but it was this game that made me a Nintendo fan. My cousin Cindy again, the girl that introduced me to Castlevania. I first saw Nintendo over her house in 1987. She was playing Excitebike. I was like, oh wow, this looks cool. My father volunteered to get me the Nintendo, but he didn't get it for a while. And I was fine. I was like, oh, Nintendo looks cool, but, no big deal. No big deal. During that time afterwards, in early 1988, I would go over to my neighbor's house, and he had Nintendo. And he had this game and other games like Kung Fu and Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! But seeing him play this game really immersed me into this Nintendo. I was like, wow, that game looks really cool. And when I would play it, I enjoyed it. And that's when I started to harp my father, when are you getting me that Nintendo? This was the game that started it all for me. To make in short, this made me a video game player. This made me a console fan. Without Super Mario Brothers, I probably would never have entered the hobby, or at least stayed in the hobby. Some people played it. It was more of a fad back then before it became really popular. And, some people drifted away from it. But it was this game and its sequels and other games that followed that kept me a fan. And all these other games that was on this list that kept me a fan throughout the ages, throughout the life cycles of these different systems, whether it was Nintendo, Super Nintendo, PlayStation, the Xbox 360, you name it. It all could originate with this game. Thank you for watching, everyone, and take care.